Hi, everyone. I'm Daniel Dench, and I'm an assistant professor of economics at Georgia Tech. Um, and I've been modeling the economic response to the coronavirus and how that impacts the economy from an economic perspective. So I think there are two big ideas that economics has to offer with regard to the economic impacts of the coronavirus. And one is that it's an individual's assessment of benefits and costs that help to determine the reaction to the virus more so than government intervention. And second, it's people's collective decision making that determines both the course of the spread of the virus, the economic impact, and there's feedback between the two. So on that first point, I think it's important to understand that in economics, the guiding principle is that people will engage in an economic activity if the benefit of that activity is greater than or possibly equal to the cost of that activity. If the benefit is greater than the cost, then they will engage in the economic activity. If the benefit is less than the cost, then they will not engage. And if the benefit is equal to the cost, then they will be ambivalent between engaging or not engaging. Okay, so let's take an example with when there's no government intervention, how people choose to either work or not work. So the benefits that people receive for working are their current wages and the future wages they receive as a result of employment. Call that W and WF. So obviously, if they're not employed, then they could have challenges getting back to work when they choose to work, and that's reflected in the benefits they get from future wages for working now. The costs are possibly the risk of dying multiplied by the cost of dying. People might say that, oh, well, how do we determine the cost of dying? Well, in economics, there are methods that we use to estimate what risks people are willing to take for certain benefits. And so people do assess their risk of dying when they choose to work or not work. And so it's an important consideration in anyone's benefit cost calculation. There's also the psychological cost of knowing they're putting their friends, family members, and community members at risk. So let's call the risk of dying multiplied by the cost of dying is D, and the psychological cost of knowing they're putting others at risk is P. And then there's also the usual cost of working, which is the opportunity cost of working instead of doing something they would prefer doing more. Okay, so that's called an opportunity cost, and we'll denote that as OC. So people compare W plus F, their benefits, to DP and OC, or they compare their wages and their future wages to their the cost of the risk of dying, the psychological cost of dying, and their opportunity cost. And they'll work if their wages and future wages as a result of working are greater than the risk of dying, the cost of the risk of dying, the psychological cost of putting others at risk, and the opportunity cost. And they won't work if the opposite is true, if those things are less than, if those benefits are less than those costs. And they'll be ambivalent between working if they're equal. Okay. Now consider a high-risk worker is thinking at the beginning of the outbreak. Originally, before the outbreak, they would consider W plus WF to be greater than the risk of dying, the psychological cost of putting others at risk, and the opportunity cost. After the outbreak, both D and P rise because the virus starts spreading and knowledge about the risks and the psychological cost to those risk rises. And this high-risk worker decides that their wages and future wages are not worth the risk, plus the other costs that they would incur otherwise, their opportunity costs. So they cease working, and economic activity is adversely affected that way. This is in the absence of any intervention. If few enough people drop out of the workforce and the virus keeps spreading, then D and P will continue to rise for everyone in the economy. So more people will drop out of the workforce as a result. And this cycle will continue until the virus ceases spreading, either because enough people have stopped working to slow the spread of the virus, or in the extreme case we reach a level of herd immunity. What if instead the government had locked down at the beginning of this virus to the point where a method like test and trace or some other method for less costly method for slowing the virus is viable? Then the economy is severely affected at the beginning, but in future periods, the economy might be able to return to some level of normal. And we wouldn't have the same spiral caused by the increases in D&P as people continue working and continue spreading the virus around. The other thing is that the government could promote a new technology, for example, masks that slows the spread of the virus without severely restricting economic activity. And that way we still wouldn't have that same spiral we saw in the first scenario from the spread of the virus that causes economic activity to be curtailed. So that's the theoretical argument for what's happening with the economics of the virus. There's also a real world example where 3 countries, Denmark, Finland, and Norway, did severely restrict their economic activity at the beginning, while Sweden chose to take a more laissez-faire, or they didn't severely restrict economic activity. At least they didn't put strong lockdowns in place. And we see that although Sweden's economic activity wasn't as affected in 2020 Q1, by the second quarter of the year, they were as severely affected as all the other groups, because likely due to the spread of the virus and the increased risk that was naturally occurring as a result of the spread of the virus in Sweden. So that's the cost-benefit trade-off that I'd like you guys to consider when you're designing your games. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions.